So good evening and welcome to the first of the 2013 Darwin Lectures. This is the 28th series of Darwin Lectures that take place every Friday evening of the Lent term. And my welcome isn't just to everyone who's made it here to the Lady Mitchell Hall on this rather wintry evening, but to people in the overflow hall on the video link, and also to the many, many thousands of people around the world who watch the video lectures later on, because they are freely available on the web, so you can always catch up later if you miss some key point. As you know, probably, each lecture series is built around a multidisciplinary theme, with every speaker tackling a different aspect. And this year, the theme is foresight. It's particularly timely to start considering foresight in January, when numerous expert pundits are successfully post-dicting 2012, and of course infallibly predicting 2013. And to what extent do we take any of them with the perhaps obsequious reverence which they deserve? Now, Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize-winning nuclear physicist, once commented that prediction is hard, especially if it's about the future. Too right, it's hard, and it's often worrying. And staying with physicists, Albert Einstein once said that, "I never think about the future, it comes soon enough." So we start this series with ancient civilizations back in the past, and our speaker tonight is Professor Sir Geoffrey Lloyd, who was Master of Darwin College here from 1989 to 2000, and is now Cambridge's Emeritus Professor of Ancient Philosophy and Science. His academic career, mostly based here in Cambridge, included visiting professorships at many universities around the world, and he's received numerous honours and awards. He's published 25 books, as well as a large number of papers, and he's been translated into a dozen languages. Seems that his expertise on Greek and Chinese thought is unequalled. In 1997, Geoffrey was knighted for services to the history of thought. The inscription in Delphi commanded us to know thyself. By understanding our past, we do indeed learn about ourselves. Thus, I warmly welcome Sir Geoffrey to speak on foresight in ancient civilizations.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction. As one of your predecessors, I had to do quite a few myself. 88, in fact. So I'm quite familiar with the genre. The tricky bit sometimes came at the end of the lecture, but it was only on rather rare occasions that I felt I had to say what the lecturer should have said as opposed to what they actually did say. But I hope I won't cause you quite such an embarrassment. Right, for foresight in ancient civilizations, and thanks first to Steve Kimberley at Classics for this collage and for my PowerPoint as a whole. I shall be putting up some texts. I'll be reading out the bits that are essential for my argument, but you can read other bits for yourselves. Given that some of this material will be pretty unfamiliar to you, I hope the texts will help. There it goes. Good health to the king, my lord. May the gods Nabu and Marduk bless the king, my lord. Concerning the watch of the moon, about which the king, my lord, wrote to me, the eclipse will pass by. It won't occur. Concerning the watch of the sun, about which the king, my lord, wrote to me, does the king, my lord, not know that it is being closely observed? The day of tomorrow is the only day left. Once the watch is over, this eclipse too will have passed by. It won't occur. The 13th day, the night of the 14th day, is the day of the watch to be held, and there will be no eclipse. I guarantee it 7 times. An eclipse will not take place. I'm writing a definitive word to the king. Nevertheless, he actually watched for the eclipse after that. He who wrote to the king, my lord, the planet Venus is visible. It is visible in the month Adjar, that's the 12th month, is a vile man, an ignoramus, a cheat. And he who wrote to the king, my lord, Venus is rising in the constellation Aries, doesn't speak the truth either. Venus isn't yet visible. Why does someone tell lies and boast about it? If he doesn't know, he should keep his mouth shut. These 3 tablets come from letters to the kings of Assyria, collected in the marvelous State Archives of Assyria series. They were written sometime around the 2nd to the 4th decades of the 7th century BCE by scribes. They were known as Tupsaru, and sometimes we know their names. The first comes from a scribe named Balasi, the third from Nabu Ahe Eriba. They're not the oldest material I shall be setting before you, but they allow me straight away to identify the main topics of my agenda. What items are the subjects of prediction? How were predictions made? On what basis did people think they could foresee the future? Why were they interested in doing so? How is foresight related first to divination in particular, and prediction in general, and then to wisdom and prudence? I should explain that I shall be concentrating on Mesopotamia, China, and the Greco-Roman world. I'm not concerned here with the tricky business of who might have transmitted what to whom and when, and besides, some of the ideas and practices I shall discuss are unique to just one ancient culture. Rather, I'm concerned to mine the very rich materials from those ancient civilizations to see what light they can throw on my 4 strategic questions. We might assume that the desire to see into the future is as old as the human race. But we should be careful. Some societies are far more focused on the immediate present, on the here and now, and don't appear to plan long term. Conversely, others, I'm thinking of India in particular, have a notion of immense cycles of millions of years, the kalpas, sometimes combining that with a belief in eternal return. That was sometimes the belief not just that similar sequences of events recur, but that identical individual ones do. Sometime, in some remote future, in some world, someone will be lecturing on foresight in ancient civilizations and waving his hand, just like me. I adapt the image from what the Greek philosopher Eudemus tells us about the notion of cyclical time that was held by certain Pythagoreans. Exact repetition. But the majority of people in most societies have been much concerned with their immediate and short-term prospects. How many of you consult your horoscopes? Of course, you don't believe what you read, but why do you do it? Out of curiosity? But on what basis? Will I pass my exams? That's an appropriate one to begin with in Cambridge. But it's not just a problem here, but a major preoccupation in modern-day Japan, for instance, to judge from the thousands of prayers one finds on the subject outside shrines. But it was also a concern in the civilization that invented the examination system, namely China. Then what will my children become when they grow up? Tinker, tailor, soldier, sailor, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. That's a bit dated, but we used to do that in my youth with cherry stones when we were lucky enough to have cherries. Is this boy or girl a suitable person for my daughter or son to marry? Will the baby be a boy or a girl? Nowadays there are tests that purport to predict that, though 2 of my grandsons were said to be granddaughters before they were born. More startlingly still, when my own second son was born, the very nice, well-educated, properly trained Cambridge midwife felt my wife's womb just before delivery and said, "It's going to be a boy." I asked her how she knew. "Well, he's on the right." That's an idea that can be found in the 5th century BCE Greek philosopher Parmenides. He's famous for having produced what he represented as a knockdown argument to show that coming to be and change are impossible. So what was he doing talking about childbirth, predicting the sex of the unborn baby? Nevertheless, he's reported as having said, on the right boys, on the left girls. Actually, he thought he could score a double victory. First, he thought he had that knockdown argument that what is cannot come to be. For it can't come to be from what is, for that is already. But nor can it come to be from what is not, for nothing can come to be from nothing. My ancient philosophy colleagues will slaughter me for that simplification, but there. So that defeated all his ancient philosophy colleagues who just assumed change and coming to be. But if anyone still held out with a conventional view that change does happen, well, Parmenides could give you a better account of that, what he called the way of seeming, than anyone else, including explaining gender differences in the developing embryo. So boys on the right. This exhibit comes from the oracle bones dating from 1200 or so BCE from Anyang in China. Crack making on day 39. Chue determined, Lady Hao will give birth, and it will be advantageous. Crack making on day 39, Chue determined, Lady Hao will give birth, but it will not perhaps be advantageous. Usually, but not it so happens in this case, an auspicious sign meant a male. An inauspicious one, a female child. Crack making was a matter of causing cracks by firing turtle shells or bones and getting an answer to a predetermined question called the charge by interpreting the pattern the cracks made. Here's a turtle shell used for 12 pairs of charges. Chue was the diviner in charge of the crack making in the last slide, but it's the king who makes the prognostication. And note, the question was put in both a positive and a negative form. It will be advantageous. It will perhaps not be advantageous. But for now, I've introduced this exhibit just to show that determining the sex of the unborn child has quite a track record in terms of recurrent human concerns. That gives us a start to the answer to my first question. What items are the subjects of prediction? The Chinese and the Mesopotamian data show that they were particularly preoccupied with whether to go to war or not, as also were the Greeks. Remember King Croesus, the king of Lydia, who took the trouble to consult the Delphic oracle about whether to invade Persia. He first tested several oracles by asking them to say what he was doing on a particular day, when there was no way in which they could have known. Delphi passes the test with flying colours. He was cooking a tortoise and lamb stew in a bronze cauldron. Actually, our source, Herodotus, says that as soon as his emissaries entered the hall at Delphi, the Pythian priestess broke into hexameter verse, claiming that she could smell what was cooking in Croesus' palace, in Sardis, miles away. Now that starting place of what I shall dub teleolifaction convinced Croesus that this was the oracle to go for and that he could trust. When he sends more emissaries with loads of gifts and asks the question, shall Croesus send an army against the Persians and should he collect allies to do so, he's told that if he invades, he will destroy a great empire. Trouble was that the empire Croesus destroyed was his own. Remember that the fourth question on my agenda, which I shall be coming to, is the relation between foresight, prediction, wisdom, and prudence. It doesn't require great skills of divination on my part to arrive at the conclusion that the items about which foreknowledge is sought tally with everything that was of concern to the individuals or groups involved. So predictions are useful evidence for those concerns and the values of the groups in question. That's one of the reasons why they're so well worthwhile studying. They're revealing evidence as to what exactly was on people's minds. Kings have their particular interests, of course: war, illnesses, journeys, births, intrigues at court, sexual partners, hunting. But groups that actually subsist on hunting also have to decide where and when to set out. I'll come back to that. And of course, it's not just important events that occupy us, but plenty of mundane ones. Betting on the outcome of chariot races was as much of a preoccupation in Byzantium in the 4th century of the Common Era as doing the pools or the national lottery today. But then my second more challenging question was, how were predictions made? On what basis did people think they could foresee the future? The answer is importantly complex, and I shall approach the problem indirectly. There are hundreds, maybe thousands, of different techniques of looking into the future that we know about from ancient and modern societies. Watching the movement of birds is a favorite in Mesopotamia, in China, and in Greece. Opening up animals and looking at their viscera, especially the liver and the gallbladder, extispicy, it's called. That's another common one. This slide gives an example of one of the models of livers that have been found in Babylonia, now in the Science Museum in London. One idea is that these were used to teach apprentice diviners how to read the signs on the livers. How did they do that? They learnt it out of books or from their teachers, neither of whom you could really call into question, not if you wanted to become an accredited diviner yourself. Dreams were another very frequent source of ideas about what was to happen. Though, as Homer already pointed out, some were veridical, some not. There was a gate of horn for dreams that will come to pass, but also a gate of ivory for those that wouldn't. But in literate societies, people also used books. In pagan antiquity, there were the famous sortes Virgilianae. You opened the text of Virgil at a particular line, and what you found was supposed to be significant. Christians were to do that a lot with the Bible. To ancient techniques, we can add many attested from present-day societies, the famous poison oracle from the Zandi, where, like the Chinese oracle bones, the question was put twice, once in a positive, once in a negative form. If the results were inconsistent, you discarded them. Or again, the intricate interpretation of the tracks made by a fox in a marked area of sand over which it ran during the night. This is reported from the Dogon and discussed by Mary Douglas in that marvelous book, Implicit Meanings. The Greeks and then the Romans, Cicero for instance, tried to establish a broad division between what they called artificial or external divination and natural or internal divination. The artificial variety depended on inspiration. Prophets needed that, and you needed that to interpret dreams. But natural divination depended on art and knowledge. The interpretation of bird signs and of celestial phenomena fell into that category. You had to know what your learned predecessors had discovered from their experience, or said they had. Here's another excerpt from the letters to Assyrian kings. If the Pleiades enter the moon, that's to say, are occulted or eclipsed by the moon, and they come out to the north, Akkad will become happy. The king of Akkad will become strong and have no rival. Well, happiness is a pretty indeterminate result, so the diviner could hope for the best, that it would turn out okay. But this one is much more specific and dangerous. If Jupiter becomes visible in the path of the Anu stars, the crown prince will rebel against his father and seize the throne. The whole of astrology gets built up on presumed correlations between signs and outcomes. Horoscopes go into considerable detail on the topic. Well, some do. There's a distinction between very basic predictions, where just the positions of the sun and moon are taken into account, and what Alex Jones, the expert on Greek horoscopes, has called the deluxe models, much more expensive, which go into great detail on the relative positions of all the heavenly bodies. There is, however, still a good deal of room for maneuver to allow the astrologer to adapt his account to the person he's dealing with. One of my ex-graduate students, Tamsin Barton, is responsible for a brilliant handbook on the subject in which she exploited just that feature, the room for manoeuvre. First, she did a horoscope for the then Professor of Ancient History. He wasn't amused. Then, this one gives her result for Prince Charles, which long before the tragic death of Diana spoke of Charles's problems with his love life. Tamsin would have been a great success in the ancient world, but she would have been lucky to have got away with such a prediction with her life. But by far and away the most elaborate of all methods of divination, I'm sure you've been waiting for it, is in the Chinese Book of Changes. Turtle cells, which we saw in an earlier exhibit, were pretty costly items. The Book of Changes had the great advantage that you use sticks of yarrow or milfoil, which are much cheaper. Actually, since the lines are associated with odd and even numbers, you could do it, as many still do, with coins, heads or tails. In the original version, you used a bundle of sticks, and by a program of sorting and discarding some, you ended up with an array of 6 broken or unbroken lines, a hexagram. This one shows you the hexagram that came to be called Ding, the cauldron. The text first gave the judgment, in this case, supreme good fortune, success, then the image, then remarks on each of the lines. I haven't given you them all on the slide. And the whole book was supplemented by extensive commentaries, the so-called 10 wings. You read the hexagram from the bottom up, but then the next complication is that some of the lines are unstable and switch into their opposites, so that your original milfoil array gives you not just one, but several possible situations. And note that in this particular case, although the overall judgment is auspicious, one of the lines, 9 in the 4th place, is associated with misfortune. You can never be too careful. By now your heads may be reeling, and you may be saying to yourselves that all this material that I've been putting before you is just dismal testimony to human self-delusion, to our capacity to kid ourselves. It is no doubt natural, you will agree, that we would like to know the future, but in the vast majority of cases, the techniques used have been hopeless, and anyone who believed in their usefulness was up a gum tree. If that thought occurred to you, you're not the first. This exhibit comes from the 1st century BCE Chinese philosopher Wang Chung. What is so special about yarrow or milfoil that sticks of the stuff can yield predictions? What's so special about the shells of turtles? They're dead, and the dead can't communicate with the living. Good, skeptical stuff. Though note from the slide that he assumes that heaven and earth are alive. Yet Wang Chung hesitates. He still thinks that it is the case that fortunate people happen to have auspicious omens, and unfortunate ones inauspicious ones. So if anyone claimed, as many did, that experience proved that there was something to these predictions, Wang Chung can explain that away, although he had no real account to offer of how that correlation happened. But he knows of cases where rulers and generals ignored the omens and got away with it. King Wu, for one, consulted the turtle, signs were adverse, threw the stalks away and trampled on the turtle, saying, "How can dried bones and dead grass know what's inauspicious?" Equally, in the great treatise on the art of war by Sun Tzu, we find a text that emphasizes the need for foreknowledge, but says that that's not to be got from ghosts and spirits, nor from plotting the positions of the heavenly bodies. No, it's to be got from knowing the enemy's situation. And how do you get that? You use spies. There are plenty of skeptics around in our other ancient civilizations too. We saw that some Mesopotamian scribes accused others of being cheats and frauds. In Greece, we have a Wang Chung-like event in Homer. In Book 12 of the Iliad, the seer Polydamas interprets a bird omen, in this case the fight between an eagle and a snake, where the snake gets away. Polydamas sees this as predicting that the Trojans, who at this point have pushed the Achaeans right back to their ships, will be thwarted of final victory. But this is greeted by Hector with, "One omen is best to defend one's country." But look at the complications. First, Hector gets his confidence from the promises he said he's had from Zeus. Secondly, Polydamas actually turns out to have got it right. The Trojans don't capture the Achaean camp. But all that skepticism just shows, doesn't it, that there were some brave souls who agreed that most techniques of divination were hopelessly deluded. But that doesn't apply to them all. 2 points here. First, as some modern anthropologists have pointed out, I'm thinking of Bascom, of G.K. Park, and the wonderfully named Omar Khayyam Moore, when a particularly tricky decision has to be taken, and it would be invidious for an individual to be solely responsible, an impersonal mode of divination may be used as the basis for a consensual verdict as to what to do. In what direction should the hunting party set out? Divination can resolve the issue without implicating any individual with blame for failure or allowing anyone to claim credit for success. Such a procedure introduces a random element in the course of action to pursue, and over the long term, the hunting may be more successful when the party doesn't always follow the same pattern. But in that case, the agent's own belief is that they're getting positive signs from some personal or impersonal agency. What we need now is to consider those cases where the prediction is in fact justified by the evidence. That was why I started with the Mesopotamian eclipse prediction. Mesopotamian astrology started with predictions about events on Earth on the basis of certain celestial phenomena, where the connections were those that the divinatory handbook, dating from between 1500 and 1200 BCE, the Enuma Anu Enlil, set out. The scribes were lucky if some of their predictions about events on Earth turned out to be correct, though in predicting whether the baby is to be a boy or a girl, you had a 50% chance of success, more or less. But then by the time that most of the letters I cited were composed, and in some cases even before, the scribes were in a position to predict certain celestial phenomena and to get them right. The scribe in Exhibit 2 is absolutely confident that the eclipse will not take place. And sometimes in the much more difficult case of predicting that an eclipse will occur, they get that one right too. An eclipse will take place. This is Raziel the Elder, he gets it right. Thanks to extensive observation of eclipse cycles carried out over centuries, they had good grounds for their predictions, at least so far as lunar eclipses go. Solar eclipses are much more difficult because of their varying visibility from different locations on the Earth's surface, though some claim that they could do them too. So here's a case where the diviner could answer the skeptic. This is not just hopelessly fanciful correlation, but based on facts. We tend to hail such achievements as major scientific breakthroughs. But we have to pay attention to the very different perspective the ancient Tupsaru had on them. They could indeed feel confident over a range of their predictions. But recall, I asked why they were concerned. That was question 3 on my agenda. Of course, if it was a matter of the much more difficult subject of medical predicting, of saying whether a patient would recover from an illness or not, in that context, there's no great difficulty in identifying the answer to that why question. We all want to know what we're suffering from and whether we shall recover. And even more, of course, we want to receive treatment that will increase our chances of doing so. But why would the ancients be bothered about drawing up lists of eclipse cycles? They weren't concerned with getting into the history books as discoverers of celestial periodicities, the discoverers of astronomy, we could even say, as opposed to astrology. Not at all. Their interest is still in what the eclipse foretold. Even after they were in a position to predict one, they still believe that an eclipse is an omen. That is, a sign that the king should pay attention to, as indicating a danger to his person or to the kingdom. There are 2 connected parts to the answer to the why question where the Babylonian Tupsaru are concerned. If the king was warned of an impending eclipse, then he could and should take evasive action. The ritual known as Namburbu involved putting someone else, usually a condemned convict, on the throne temporarily, so that whatever evil happened would happen to the substitute king rather than to the real one, who was meanwhile referred to not as king, but as the farmer. You see, all sorts of assumptions about causation are in play here. It seems that whoever or whatever was responsible for the evil occurrence was taken in by the substitution, as if it were the throne itself that was some kind of lightning conductor, that it conducted the evil to the throne, not away from it. So provided you didn't actually sit on the throne, you were safe. But the second part of the answer to the why question concerns the relationship between the Tupsaru and the king himself. When scribes could tell the king what to do, that showed how seriously their predictions were taken. When they got it right, their prestige naturally grew enormously. That is why so much is at stake between one scribe with one prediction and another with another. He who told the king, my lord, that Venus is visible is a cheat, you remember, an ignoramus. He shouldn't boast but keep his mouth shut. This particular tablet was given the modern title, The King Must Give Up Fasting. To the king our lord, your servants Balasi and Nabu Ahe Eriba, they're our old friends. Good health to the king our lord. May Nabu, the king after whom Nabu Ahe Eriba was named, and Marduk bless the king our lord. The king our lord will pardon us. Is one day not enough for the king to mope and to eat nothing? For how long still? This is already the third day when the king doesn't eat anything. The king, a beggar. Surely when at the beginning of the month the moon appears, he says, I will not fast anymore. It's the beginning of the month. I want bread to eat and wine to drink. The king can ask for food for even the whole of the year. We became worried and were afraid, and that is why we are now writing to the king. We see the battles for prestige and influence at work. On the one hand, these observers of the heavens and of other natural phenomena, as we would call them, were indeed intent on trying to get it right. But as I said, what was at stake was reputation, as indeed it still is. Medical prognostication was much more difficult than celestial, but we see the reputation element at work here too. This slide comes from a Hippocratic treatise called Prognostic, and it tackles the problem directly. It seems to me to be an excellent thing for a doctor to practice forecasting. For if he discover and declare in advance by the side of his patients, that's to say without his patients actually telling him, the present, the past, and what will happen in the future, and supply what the sick have omitted in their accounts, he will be the more believed to understand the problems of the sick, so that people will confidently entrust themselves to the doctor. Furthermore, he will carry out the treatment best if he knows beforehand from their present sufferings what will happen later. Now, to make every sick person well is impossible. To do so, indeed, would have been even better than forecasting the future. Good point. But then he reverts to his usual preoccupation. In this way, you will rightly be an object of admiration and be a good doctor. For the longer time you plan in advance to meet each contingency, the greater your ability to save those who have a chance of recovery, when you will be blameless if you learn and declare beforehand those who will die and those who will get better. It's pretty optimistic, one might say, that the doctor will be blameless if he's predicted the patient's death. But the fact that that point is made illustrates how, from the doctor's point of view, it's his reputation that he's concerned about. He needs to do the best job he can in making his prognosis, in part at least because that will build up the confidence of his clientele. So we come to foresight and the fourth main question on my agenda, which was the relations between foresight, divination, prediction, prudence, and wisdom. At this point, we have to get a bit analytic, but if I've carried you so far, I hope I can take you a little further. Prediction I take to be the generic term for being able to make statements about what will happen, useful in all sorts of contexts, and evidently a recurrent human preoccupation. Divination is one mode of prediction, used especially when the connection between the evidence used for the prediction and the result that is actually predicted may be opaque, a matter of convention, based simply on what tradition has laid down by way of correlations between signs and outcomes. Another Hippocratic author is relevant here. This slide comes from the Treatise on Regimen in Acute Diseases. It points out the consequences of the current disagreements between doctors on the proper remedies to apply for particular complaints. The art as a whole gets a very bad name with ordinary people, so that it's thought there's no art of medicine at all. What one doctor prescribes as the best treatment, another considers bad. So that people say that the art is like divination. For diviners, too, think that the same bird is a good omen if it's on the left, but it's a bad one if it's on the right, while other diviners think the opposite. Actually, that's quite a cunning move, given that the normal belief was that it was birds on the right that were auspicious. By citing first the non-standard view that birds on the left are, the Hippocratic author contrives to undermine further any belief in bird prognostication at all. Of course, the doctors claimed that their signs were reliable, but very different ones were used in different ancient medical traditions. From that point of view, they were very much in the same boat as the diviners. It took quite an effort to establish genuine causal connections, and I'll come back to that too. If divination can be said to be a mode of prediction, where does foresight fit into the taxonomy? Evidently, it overlaps with prediction, but it doesn't necessarily involve a precise foretelling of what will come about. Rather, what it does depend on is some sense of what is likely to occur, especially the probable consequences of different courses of action. We need it, don't we know, when we're dealing with questions of policy. What will happen if we deregulate the banks? That's not an ancient example, since they didn't have much by way of banks, for better or worse, probably for better. But how to deal with relations with foreign states, how to ensure the productivity of the land, even how to make taxation equitable, they all figure in our ancient sources often enough. Many of the figures whom I've been citing were advisors. Certainly the Mesopotamian Tupsaru were constantly advising their kings. Oracles were consulted in the Greco-Roman world to get advice on what to do. The Persians were about to invade Athens. Delphi said, "Put your trust in your wooden walls." There was a dispute about that one too. Some said that that meant the wooden fortifications of the Acropolis, but Themistocles said, "Ships." The ship's interpretation won out, and indeed the Athenians were, of course, victorious at Salamis. The oracle bones in China were consulted on many similar practical issues. Many of the great names in Chinese philosophy, from Confucius onwards, served as advisors. In his case, he went from state to state, never finding a ruler who was worthy enough to receive his advice. In fact, a common generic term for those we call Chinese philosophers was youshui, literally itinerant advisors. The trouble with foresight is how to acquire it. How do you become good at it? Here, there weren't any big books from which you could learn the skill, like the divination handbooks you were expected to learn by heart. There were, however, role models, figures of legend mostly. The Greeks had a paradigmatic foreseer who might be considered a pretty disastrous example to follow, Prometheus. One problem with Prometheus was that he had a younger brother, Epimetheus. He told Epimetheus never to trust Zeus, never to accept a gift from him. But when Zeus, disgusted that Prometheus had stolen fire and given it to human beings, took his revenge, that took the form of the first woman, Pandora. But don't let me get distracted. Epimetheus accepted it, and Pandora opened the box, or rather the jar, and let every kind of evil loose on humans. They were the gifts the gods gave humans, from which she got her name Pandora, all part of Zeus's plans for revenge. Prometheus should have foreseen that it wasn't good enough just to warn his brother about Zeus. Then did Prometheus anticipate the punishment that Zeus would inflict on him? Pretty vindictive, this god. Namely, to chain him to a rock and have an eagle eat his liver. The liver, however, regenerated every night, so that the eagle would be able to continue the torture the next day and the next to eternity, or until his release, if it ever came. Of course, in a sense, if Prometheus had foreseen that, it makes him even more heroic and generous to humans. But we're not told he foresaw his own punishment, and we might rather conclude that his foresight had its limitations. It generally does. The Chinese had their role models too, the sage kings, helpfully juxtaposed to the legendary tyrants, to get across the message that the former concentrated on the welfare of the people, of all under heaven, indeed, Tiansha, as the ancient Chinese said, while the latter was self-indulgent and neglected their people, who suffered all sorts of misery as a consequence. But the historical figure Confucius also acted as a model. In one text, he shows where his priorities lie, and that's not with divination, although he doesn't reject divination entirely. Zhegung, one of his pupils, asks the master, does the master also believe in milfoil divination? To which the master replies, as for the changes, that's the book of changes I talked about before, I do indeed put its prayers and divination last, only observing its virtue and propriety. You can use the commendations to get to the number, but if the commendations don't lead to the number, then one acts merely as a magician. If the number doesn't lead to virtue, then one merely acts as a scribe. Perhaps it will be because of the changes that knights of later generations will doubt me. I seek its virtue and nothing more. The conduct of the gentleman's virtue is to seek blessings. That is why he sacrifices but little. The righteousness of his humaneness is to seek auspiciousness. That is why he divines, but rarely. Of course, understanding Confucius takes the most strenuous and concerted efforts of your reason and imagination. But there's a rather more accessible source of the kind of practical foresight you need: history. Two of the greatest historians, one Chinese, one Greek, were very conscious of the point. Sima Qian completed the work that his father Sima Tan had begun, the first great Chinese universal history, the Shiji, composed between about 100 and about 80 BCE. This had several sections: dynastic histories, chronological tables, treatises on such topics as agriculture, and yes, the study of the heavens, astronomy and astrology, as well as chapters devoted to the biographies of various types of people, including harsh officials, moneymakers, and assassin retainers. Most of the chapters are punctuated with comments on the lessons that can be learnt from what has been recorded, introduced with "the grand scribe says," where sometimes this is Sima Qian, sometimes his dad. Take the end of the story of the rebel Xiang Yu. He had ignored the lessons of antiquity and tried to take the empire by force. But right to the end of his life, after his final defeat, he still didn't wake up and lay the responsibility for his mistakes on himself. Thus, surely he was deluded to invoke the words, "Heaven is destroying me," and it's not anything I have done wrong in the use of the military. But it isn't just the case that over and over again Sima Qian ponders the lessons of history. He makes it quite clear that his history itself is intended to be such a source of instruction. Twice we find texts that suggest that the past remembered is a guide to the future, and that learning from the past can provide a key to success and failure in one's own age. That's a trope that antedates systematic historiography in both China and Greece. I'm thinking of the recurrent moralizing tales of how drink and indulgence in sex lead to you losing your kingdom in China, and those relating to how pride, arrogance, hubris herald your eventual comeuppance in Greece. But in the historians, the topos is thematized and becomes crucial. Foresight, the lesson is, can be gained by immersing yourself in the past. That is always a matter of interpretation, to be sure, but the outcome of different modes of behavior, of different policies, was there for all to see. And if the greatest early Chinese historian puts it that way, my Greek example, Thucydides, is perhaps even more explicit. He distances himself from his predecessors, whose histories were redolent of what Thucydides considered mere storytelling, the mythical indeed. He has Herodotus, among others, in his sights, but he names no names. What he offers, by contrast, is, in his famous phrase, a possession for always, a repository of wise advice for all to learn from. That is thanks to the assumption that human affairs repeat themselves, not in the sense of exact repetition, as in the eternal return I mentioned, but rather that there are constant principles at work. It has sometimes not been noticed that Thucydides' account of the ravages of civil war in Greece is twice juxtaposed with his account of the plague that hit Athens in particular around the year 430 BCE. He himself suffered from it, and he tells us why he gives a detailed description of it. Namely, I shall say what it was like and set out the details from the study of which a person may be able to recognize it if it should ever attack again. I shall do so because I both suffered from the disease myself and saw other victims of it. Whether there was just one pathogen responsible for everything the plague covered is problematic. Attempts at retrospective diagnosis have varied, and truth to tell, all fail to account for all the signs and symptoms in the record. In equivalent texts in the Hippocratic corpus relating to epidemics, it's more usually recognized that several diseases were present, even though certain conditions were particularly prominent. Neither Greek doctors nor Chinese ones could do much to help their patients when they suffered from acute conditions, such as what we would diagnose as malaria. Yet the intensity with which individual case histories and more general epidemics were observed and recorded is witness to their valiant attempts to get a handle on pathological causation. And as we saw in the text from Prognostic I quoted, at least to be able to foresee likely outcomes. For successful treatment, ancient doctors needed more than just foresight, they needed effective cures, and they were in short supply. But so far as foresight was concerned, their dedication to the task of building up a database, to gaining just that ability to foresee outcomes, was extraordinary. Thucydides thinks that human affairs are subject to factors that are more or less constant over time, just like diseases. One can go further. The account of the plague is there, so he tells us, so that we should be forewarned. His whole history, we may say, is similarly there to help us to be on our guard against what he represents as the sicknesses of the body politic, notably civil strife. So what lessons do I draw from the complex data that I put before you? I feel that maybe I shall have failed in my task if you can't foresee my conclusions. So my summary of my argument will be brief, though I have one new point to add. Greeks, Babylonians, Chinese, I could have added Indians and Egyptians too, as I said, were all obsessed, just as we are, with trying to be able to see what is in store for individuals, for groups, for whole civilizations. As we've seen, in their attempts to do so, they tried out hundreds of different methods. Some were spot on. Eclipses came to be predictable since their periodicities could be derived on the reliable basis of previous observations. Many more techniques were said to be based on experience, but relied on non-existent causal connections, as some of the ancients themselves protested, though that didn't stop them continuing to be used. But is that not so still today? Think of economics. At the same time, many ancient writers did their best to draw out the lessons from human experience. That was an important motive for historians, analysts, memorialists, writers of all sorts. This wasn't usually to make precise predictions, but to plot probable or possible consequences of different actions and policies. This was generally a matter of just seeing what followed from what had happened in similar circumstances in the past. But it was often a question of focusing on what is right, proper, beneficial, on values, in other words. When that was the case, more was involved than just learning about events. It wasn't just a matter of prediction, nor just a matter of foreknowledge, but a matter of wisdom. It may have been in short supply in ancient civilizations, but again, how can we not agree the same is true today? It doesn't take a crystal ball to get the answer. Ancient foresight has lessons for our claims to foresight today, about our fallibility, about our gullibility, about our need to work hard to get it right, and above all, to do what is right. I'm sure that subsequent lectures in this series will have plenty to say about that. Thank you.
So Sir Geoffrey has taken us on a fascinating journey through the ancient history of prediction and foresight. What people predicted, how they predicted, why they predicted, and of course how it's tied up and related back to prudence and wisdom. And there's really no need at all for me to summarise by telling you what he should have said, because he's done a magnificent job. You realise that people haven't changed much at all through the millennia. Reputation and prestige still matter hugely to people today. And you realise that we're still all obsessed with the future, and we frequently still have problems linking causality with events, with possible causes and consequences. In some ways, we're no different to the ancients. We like to know the future. We are not good always at discovering how to predict or determine what it might be. So thank you very much indeed, Sir Geoffrey, for an absolutely fascinating lecture to start this year's Darwin Lecture Series.
Thank you.